Your only duty is to sleep with my dogs. Let that sink in. Think long and hard about it, and give me your answer by tomorrow morning.
Oh my god.
What will be her fate? Will she suffer the same deadly end as the others? Join us to uncover the truth. Don't forget to subscribe.
Jessica had always been a fighter. Life had thrown countless hardships her way, but she refused to let them break her spirit. From an early age, she had learned that survival required resilience, and she carried that lesson with her through every struggle. When she lost her husband, she was already battling the weight of responsibilities, but the loss nearly shattered her. Pregnant with her younger son, she had no choice but to stand tall, refusing to let despair consume her. With 2 young boys depending on her, Jessica worked tirelessly, taking on multiple jobs to make ends meet. She woke up before dawn to clean offices, spent her afternoons working as a cashier, and took in sewing projects at night just to ensure her children never went to bed hungry. Every penny she owned was carefully saved with one goal in mind: her son's future. She had promised herself that no obstacle would prevent them from receiving the education they desired. Even if it meant sacrificing her own dreams, she was willing to endure any hardship. Her love was her strength, and despite the storms she faced, Jessica never wavered. She was determined to turn her pain into purpose. When Jessica heard about an opportunity abroad, it felt like divine intervention. A job in Saudi Arabia promised better pay, stability, and the chance to give her children the life she had always dreamed of for them. She saw hope where there had once been only struggle. The thought of finally being able to afford good education, proper health care, and a comfortable home for her sons filled her with determination. Without hesitation, she applied for the position, went through the necessary processes, and obtained a visa. Though the thought of leaving her children behind pained her, she knew this sacrifice was necessary for their future. She entrusted her 2 boys to her aging mother, whispering promises of return, and boarded the plane with a heart full of hope and uncertainty. As she left Nigeria, she carried nothing but dreams, faith, and an unyielding resolve to build a better life. Jessica arrived in Saudi Arabia with a heart full of optimism and hope. Stepping onto foreign soil, she believed this was the beginning of a better future for her sons. She was assigned as a housemaid to the Rakan family, Mr. Rakan, his wife Dana, and their young son Nasser. Determined to prove herself, she worked tirelessly, keeping her head down and focusing on her duties. For the first few days, things seemed manageable. She found solace in her routine, reminding herself that every task she completed brought her children one step closer to a brighter future. But her sense of relief was short-lived. After just a week, the house transformed into a living nightmare. The warm welcome she had received quickly faded, replaced by cold glaze, harsh words, and unreasonable demands. What had once felt like an opportunity now felt like a cruel twist of fate. Mr. Rakan, a man in his late 50s, carried himself with an air of entitlement, his presence casting a suffocating shadow over the household. At first, Jessica had tried to ignore the way his eyes lingered on her, the way he stood just a little too close when she was working. It started subtly, a hand that brushed against her lower back as she set the dining table, fingers that trailed along her arm under the pretense of handing her something. Each touch made her skin crawl, but she kept her head down, unwilling to believe the worst. But soon, the subtle gestures turned into something more sinister. She caught him watching her from darkened corners, his gaze filled with something vile. His compliments became inappropriate, his tone heavy with suggestion. Jessica lived in constant fear, dreading the moment she found herself alone in the house with him. She knew she was powerless. She had no family here, no one to turn to, no way to escape. Then came the night that confirmed her worst fears. She had been scrubbing the floors of his bedroom, lost in the monotony of her work, when she heard the door click shut behind her. The sound sent a chill through her spine. Jessica turned her head slowly, her breath hitching in her throat as she saw him standing there, his hand still on the lock. The look in his eyes made her stomach churn. "Come here," he ordered, his voice dangerously calm. Jessica's hands trembled as she gripped the wet rag. "So, I need to finish cleaning," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll do what I say," he snapped, his expression darkening as he strode toward her. Before she could react, his hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her toward him. She struggled, twisting and pushing against his chest, but he was too strong. Panic surged through her veins. She couldn't let this happen. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she lifted her knee and kicked him hard in the shin. He let out a sharp cry of pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to break free. Jessica stumbled backward, her heart pounding, then turned and ran. She tore through the house, her breath ragged, her hands shaking. She had never felt terror like this before. Later that night, as Jessica lay curled up on her thin mattress, fear gripped her like a vice. She stared at the ceiling, her body rigid with tension. Then she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps outside her door. Her breath hitched, the handle turned, the door creaking open just an inch before stopping. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she squeezed her eyes shut. A low chuckle drifted in from the hallway, chilling her to the bone. Then, silence. The door never opened fully, but the message was clear. He wasn't finished with her yet. Terror kept her awake. The next morning, Jessica knew she couldn't stay silent. The fear from the previous night still clung to her like a shadow, but she had to try. She had to believe that someone in this house had a shred of humanity. Summoning her courage, she approached Mrs. Dana, her voice trembling as she recounted what had happened. Mrs. Dana's reaction was instant and cruel. Her elegant features twisted with disgust as she crossed her arms, looking Jessica up and down with contempt. "You think my husband would touch someone like you?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Ungrateful girl. Do your work and stop making up lies." Jessica's heart sank. Any hope she had clung to shattered in that moment. Not only had Mrs. Dana refused to believe her, but she had made it clear that Jessica's suffering meant nothing. From that day forward, her life became unbearable. Mrs. Dana turned her into a punching bag, ensuring that every moment in the house was pure torment. The workload tripled. Jessica was expected to rise before dawn and work deep into the night with no breaks. If she so much as paused to rest, she was met with harsh words and threats. Her food portions dwindled until she was left with scraps barely enough to sustain her. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, but the emotional torment was even worse. Mrs. Dana hurled insults at her daily, degrading her at every opportunity. Jessica felt trapped in a never-ending nightmare. She had come here for a better life, but now she was barely surviving. Then, one night, it happened again. Jessica had just finished scrubbing the kitchen floor when she sensed a presence behind her. A chill ran down her spine. Before she could turn, a firm hand clamped around her wrist. Her breath caught in her throat as terror flooded her veins. Desperate, she reached for her only hope, her phone. Shaking, she dialed the agent's number, praying for rescue. But like every other time, the line was disconnected. She was completely alone. Days later, while cleaning the downstairs hall, Jessica found herself trapped once again. She had been lost in her work, scrubbing the marble floors, when she suddenly sensed movement behind her. Before she could react, Mr. Rakan was there, cutting off her escape. This time, there was no hesitation, no pretense, no one around to witness. He grabbed her by the waist, pressing her against the cold wall, his breath hot against her neck. "No one will believe you," he murmured, his grip tightening. "Go to the authorities if you like, there would be no evidence." Jessica's heart pounded wildly. Panic clawed at her chest, but she refused to surrender. Summoning every ounce of strength, she fought back. She scratched his arms, kicked wildly, and let out a piercing scream. Mr. Rakan cursed under his breath, struggling to restrain her. But Jessica wouldn't stop. In sheer desperation, she sank her teeth into his hand. He let out a furious roar, yanking his arm back in pain. That was her chance. Gasping for air, she shoved him away and bolted. Her feet barely touched the floor as she sprinted toward the servant quarters. The moment she stepped inside, she slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her trembling body against it. Tears streamed down her face as she listened, waiting. Silence. But she knew it wasn't over. Now the question lingered. Would there be a way out? Who would come to her rescue? The following morning, the situation had worsened beyond her worst fears. Her passport was gone, and she was effectively trapped, her freedom stolen. Days passed in a blur of anxiety, and the walls around her seemed to close in tighter. Fear became her constant companion. Every shadow made her flinch, every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing. She lay awake at night, bracing for the door to open again, the isolation growing ever more suffocating. Then came Nasser. At first, he was different, gentle, even apologetic for his father's behavior. She let down her guard, thinking she had found an ally. But soon, he, too, began entering her room uninvited. One night, he slid into her room under the pretense of comforting her. Jessica pushed him away, but he laughed. "I won't hurt you," he said. "Just be nice to me, and I'll protect you." She felt sick. There was no escape. One evening, Mr. Rakan and his wife returned home earlier than usual and found Jessica speaking with Nasser in the living room. The sight of the two together was enough to ignite their fury. Without a word, they exploded in a violent rage, shouting accusations at her. Mrs. Dana's face twisted with disgust as she screamed, her words cutting deep. "You're nothing but a filthy liar," she spat. "You think you can seduce my son? You disgust me." Jessica, shocked and trembling, tried to explain herself, her voice shaky. "Please, my passport. I need my passport." "Leave." Mrs. Dana shrieked, her face contorted with rage. Without another glance, she and Mr. Rakan dragged Jessica out of the house and threw her into the street as if she were nothing more than trash. The gate slammed shut behind her, leaving her alone in the unforgiving night. Homeless, penniless, and now stranded in a foreign country with no one to turn to, Jessica stood there, helpless and broken. She wandered the streets, her mind spinning, trying to process what had just happened. Despair overwhelmed her as she realized she had no means of survival. Desperate, she tried calling the agency that had brought her to Saudi Arabia, but the number had been disconnected. She had nothing. No family, no home, no hope. Just the cold, dark streets stretching endlessly before her. As Jessica stumbled along the road, barely able to keep her balance, a car screeched to a halt, narrowly missing her. The driver, a well-dressed, wealthy man named Mr. Majid, leaped out, his face contorted in fury. "Are you insane?" he shouted, his voice laced with anger. But as his gaze fell on her disheveled appearance and heard her quiet, pleading words, his fury slowly faded. She explained her situation, her voice trembling with exhaustion. His expression softened, and he studied her for a moment before asking, "You need work and a home?" Desperate, Jessica nodded vigorously, her heart pounding with hope. Mr. Majid seemed to consider her for a brief moment before giving a curt nod. Without another word, he gestured for her to get into the car. For a fleeting moment, Jessica felt a wave of relief wash over her, grateful to have found someone willing to help. But as the days passed, that relief quickly faded. Something didn't feel right. The other workers at Mr. Majid's home barely acknowledged her presence. When she tried to ask them about her duties or what was expected of her, they merely looked away, avoiding eye contact. Their silence made her uneasy, and a creeping sense of dread began to gnaw at her. One day, Mr. Majid took Jessica around the sprawling compound, showing her the various parts of his property. They passed the fish pond, the poultry, and even the pigs, each area more isolated than the last. When they reached the dogs' cages, he stopped and turned to her with a cold smile. "You will take care of my dogs," he said, his voice firm and matter-of-fact. "You will clean them, feed them, and sleep with them." At first, Jessica dismissed the last part of his statement as a twisted joke, trying to laugh it off. But Majid's expression didn't change. He repeated his words slowly, making sure she understood every single detail. "You will sleep with them," he said again, his eyes locked onto hers. Do you understand everything I've said? A deep chill swept through Jessica's body, and her blood ran cold. The unease that had been gnawing at her since she arrived suddenly made sense. The eerie silence of the other workers, the way they avoided her eyes, it had all been a warning she hadn't understood until now. This was never about kindness or offering her a home. It was a trap. She stood frozen, her heart racing so hard it felt like it might burst. Mr. Majid smirked at her reaction. "I want you to sleep on it and get back to me tomorrow," he said, his tone almost casual, as if he were offering her a simple choice. That night, Jessica lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with horror. How can a human be forced to sleep with a dog? The very thought made her stomach turn. God forbid. She screamed in her mind, pressing her trembling hands against her chest. It was an abomination, something she could never accept. Fear clawed at her, but she refused to give in. Taking a deep breath, she whispered a simple, desperate prayer into the darkness. "God, please deliver me from this. Make a way for me." Tears streamed down her face as she clung to hope. By morning, she met him, forcing herself to stay calm. "I need 2 weeks," she said, her voice steady. "I'm on my monthly flow." It was true, but she also needed those 2 weeks to plan her escape. The tension in the house remained suffocating, each moment stretching unbearably. Strangely, that was when the other staff finally broke their silence, their voices hushed and fearful. Their warnings sent chills down her spine. "If he wants something from you, you either give in or disappear without a trace." Jessica's heart pounded, but she refused to let fear control her. She clenched her fists, determination burning within her. "No, I will not let this be my fate." She vowed she wouldn't give up. No matter the risk, she would find a way out, before it was too late. Days passed in suffocating terror. Jessica barely slept, each night haunted by the growing unease of what might come next. The dogs grew restless, sensing her fear, pouring at her whenever she stepped into their enclosure. She knew she had to act fast before it was too late. Determined, she devised a plan. She forced herself to feign obedience, acting friendly toward Majid, carefully lowering her guard with smiles and nods. She waited until the right moment before planting the idea. "So," she said cautiously, "we're running out of dog food." Majid barely glanced at her. "Go buy more, with the driver," he said, tossing her some money. Her heart pounded. This was her chance. She climbed into the car beside the driver, gripping the money tightly, trying to control the shaking in her hands. But as the driver turned the key, the engine sputtered and refused to start. Majid, irritated, waved a dismissive hand. "Go get it yourself," he ordered. Jessica didn't hesitate. The moment her feet hit the ground, she ran. She ran like she had never run before, her breath ragged, her heart pounding against her ribs. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop. She could hear Majid's men shouting behind her, their footsteps pounding against the dirt as they chased her. She pushed forward, darting into a crowded marketplace. She weaved through stalls, ducked behind carts, pressed herself against strangers, doing everything to disappear into the sea of people. Finally, she spotted it, a police station. With the last of her strength, she stumbled toward it, collapsing at the entrance. Through desperate sobs, she told them everything. Majid was arrested, and Jessica was finally free. Authorities arranged for her return to Nigeria, and though she left Saudi Arabia with nothing, she carried the weight of survival, the greatest victory of all. As the vehicle came to a stop, she stepped out, her heart pounding. Then she saw them, her sons, standing there, waiting. The moment their eyes met, she broke down, collapsing into their arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She held them tightly, afraid to let go, as if they might dissipate. She had returned without riches. No fortune, no grand success. But she had something far more precious, her life. And she had her children. Through her suffering, Jessica had learned a painful truth. Not all opportunities lead to prosperity. Some are traps, cruelly designed to ensnare the desperate. Her ordeal became a warning to others. Sometimes, The promise of greener pastures hides the deadliest of swamps.
Thank you for watching. Tell us your opinion in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel Chukwudi Studio at Chukwudi